we, in celebration of Black History Month, have brought a special guest who we're really excited to introduce to you guys. He's going to just help us talk about how Black history and theology inform our pursuit of God and redeemed humanity. And so we'll talk about a lot of interesting topics, basically about whatever it is that you guys want to talk about. And so without further ado, I'm just going to give you guys his bio. So our guest for tonight is Jemar Tisby. He got his bachelor's from Notre Dame and his MDiv from which theological seminary? Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson. And he's the president and co-founder of the Reformed African American Network, where he blogs about theology, race, and culture. And he's also the co-host of the podcast Pass the Mic, which amplifies dynamic voices for a diverse church. His writing has been featured on Urban Faith, Christianity Today, and Christian Research Journal, and he has spoken nationwide at conferences on racial reconciliation, U.S. history, and the church. Jemar serves as the director of the African American Leadership Initiative and special assistant to the chancellor at the Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson. He's a PhD student in history at the University of Mississippi, and he's studying race and religion in the 20th century. And he's a member of the Presbyterian Church in America, is married and has one child, and you can follow him on Twitter at Jemar Tisby. So, oh yeah, that's the cute, right? He's so official. All right. So without further ado, will y'all help me welcome our guest, Jemar Tisby. So feel free to have a seat and get comfortable. Oh, and there's one more thing that we wanted to ask you about as far as your family background goes. Because it's our understanding that you have an additional member of the family that we
okay, I'm gonna get Corey. Let me tell you though.
We just want to understand, like.
Let me tell you though. Listen, this makes perfect sense, right? See, a lot of people think men have to be dog lovers, right? Man's best friend. I contend.
Share your thesis.
Amen. The cat is actually man's best friend.
Come on.
Think about it. Amen. The cat is independent, right? A cat is built for its purpose, okay? You know, some of you who study biology know that when you have eyes, both eyes in front rather than on the side, you're a predator, so you can judge distance better. The cat's claws curve inward so that it can grasp its prey. It's built and designed for a purpose, much like we are. And it's no coincidence a black cat either, so.
Okay, all right.
I'm just, you know.
Like power and exemplified in the cat.
I'm just saying, so.
Okay, all right.
I think a cat is a very manly pet.
Okay, so what about the turtleneck?
There is a zipper there. It is a mock neck. And this is probably like 2006.
Okay, all right, so you know what it is, 10 years back. We're a decade better.
Okay, I got you, Corey. I got you.
Yeah, Corey Shader. So
Definitely switch that now, though.
yeah, do something a little bit more friendly to our guests. So thank you for being here with us tonight. We're really glad to have you. What is your vision for the night? You were sharing that with me a little bit before we started.
So Q&As are my favorite thing to do, aside from all the presentations and whatnot, because Q&As are where folks can really get real. They can talk about what's actually on their minds and heart. You get to have an interaction and not just be didactic or lecture. And so I really want this to be a night where you feel like you don't have to be politically correct, where you don't have to feel like you're walking on eggshells. You don't have to feel like you're asking a stupid question or a basic question. Let's put it all out there. Number one, because I can say whatever I want and leave, and then James has to clean up the mess. But really, it is a time, you're going to get out of it what you put into it. So the more honest and raw your questions are, I think the more we'll all get out of it. And, you don't have to be afraid of offending me or anything like that. So, yeah, let's just do it that way.
Thank you. So I'll start us off with some questions, and then before long, we'll just open it up to the audience, and we can ask whatever questions we want around. I mean, we talked about how his expertise, his study that he's going to be a doctor into, or that he has a doctorate in, is raised
67 years, yeah.
raised in religion in the 20th century. So we can talk about the past into present day, which is just exactly the kind of conversation we want for Black History Month. And so I guess we can start with just letting people get to know you and your network a little bit more. Can you talk more about just what is RAND, what is the Reformed African American Network, and why is it needed, and kind of what was the story of how that came into being?
So depending on your background, when you hear the word reformed, you're like, has he gone to jail? Does he turn his life around? You don't necessarily know what that means. When we talk about reformed, I talk about theologically reformed. And so this 2017 is the 500th year anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the church doors in Wittenberg. And so when we talk about Reformed theology, we're talking about the Protestant Reformation, and we're talking about all of the teaching and the theology that has come from that in the past half millennium. And so it's a theological distinction. There are some distinctives, the grace alone, faith alone, Christ alone, those kinds of things, the five solas. I'm a Presbyterian, and so I subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith. But as it pertains to the network, we're pretty Big Tent when we talk about reform. And what RAN is a way to address the core concerns of African Americans biblically. And so if you look at a lot of the prominent Christian sites, they're predominantly white, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what happens is you speak to your audience. And so the concerns of the majority are going to be oftentimes different than the concerns of the minority. So what we want to do is highlight some of those issues from a biblical perspective. We've also got a podcast. If you have a smartphone, all you need to do is go to your podcast app and look up Pastor Mike, P-A-S-S-M-I-C, and you'll find us. It's a blue microphone and a black background. We've had phenomenal guests on there, from Tony Evans to Soong Chan Ra to Tim Keller to John Piper to, you name it. So we just did one. This past episode is called Is the Black Church Dead? And it actually interacts with Dr. Glaud's article saying that the Black Church is dead from a couple years ago. So yeah, y'all want to listen to that. My man Tyler, who's the co-host, goes off at the end. It's good stuff.
So that, I guess, that gives us a little bit of an insight into some of the topics that are covered. Are there any other topics that kind of stand out to you as like kind of what you guys get to talk about and share about on it?
So the website is randnetwork.org, raanetwork.org, and I invite you to visit it. When you go there, you're going to find a lot of articles on race. So this is actually finally a platform for African American or Black Christians to talk about what it's like to be a Christian and be a person of color. And so you'll get that on there a lot. Anything from being a minority in a predominantly white institution to interracial dating to the Black church. You'll also find a lot, because of the past year or so in current events, you'll find a lot on politics, but not just like Democrat, Republican. You'll find a lot on just justice and what does it look like to do justice in public. So I'm kind of excited about those.
Yeah, so I actually would love to hear your thoughts on that question, is the Black church dead? That's kind of a bold statement, and I think any defense that says otherwise also needs to come back bold, and I'm just wondering, I think I saw on your Twitter something about Dr. King's dream remaining forever or something like that. And so I want to know, do you think that the Black church historically is still relevant? Do we need, there's often the conversation about the distinction between the old guard and the new Black movement. So do you feel like there's anything still relevant from the old? Do we need to learn from the new something that was missing from the old? Do we need to learn from Malcolm X? Oftentimes, the Black church and the Black civil rights movement is often thought of as Martin Luther King, and Malcolm is kind of on the side. So I guess, what are your thoughts about what was right, what we're learning from, what remains?
There's about 50 questions in there. I'll try to. One, is the Black church dead? Absolutely not. Primarily because the Black church is part of Christ's church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And so there's no sense in which any true church will ever be dead. Christ is preserving his bride. And so in that sense, of course, the black church is not dead. Many of us were saved in the black church. The black church continues to foster faith and strengthen people. The black church has been the ark for African Americans. I put out I rant on Twitter occasionally. And a couple of days ago, I put out something like, black people could not form institutions for most of the history of the United States. You couldn't make your own schools. It wasn't until Reconstruction, when there was federal money and really white teachers from the North coming down and helping to start schools, that we even had schools. You couldn't have your own bank. You couldn't have any social organization. The only thing you had was your religious community, and that was the black church. And the black church has been the nurturer and the developer of hope and faith throughout our history here. And it still is, and I'll tell you why I believe that. See, one of the critiques of the black church is that you always refer to it in the past tense, what it was or what it has done. Well, number one, as someone who studies history, I think that the past is very important to the present and who we are now as a result of what the church has been to us. So let's not diminish the importance of the past, but even saying that, contemporarily, when you look at if disaster strikes, someone has been killed, a community is hurting, where do people still turn? In my view, it is still the black church. If you look at some of the marches, if you look at some of the organizations, even though they'll be less overtly Christian in some cases, it's still the black church that's the center of the community. It's still black clergy leading these protests, leading these movements, getting arrested, having the prophetic word. And so is it exactly like it was? No. When you study history, you see that history really doesn't repeat itself. Every situation is contextual, right? So the America we live in 2017 isn't the America of 1967, for better or worse. And because of that, it's not going to be exactly the same. But I still think the black church has a very important role to play. So that was one part. I can keep going, but whatever you want to do.
Okay. I guess when you talk about we still have an important role to play, what do you think is that role? And I think, could you speak to maybe some of the reasons why that criticism comes up, especially with regards to how the black church relates to issues of like social justice, and maybe also parse out what you're meaning when you say black church, because I realize we're kind of using that term as though we like just have this, I don't know, idea in mind, but what exactly are we referring to, or is it even just one thing?
Well, I'll definitely refer you to the podcast because we spent like an hour talking about it. But I think three things. One, I've already touched on. What is the black church? It is the church. It is Christ's bride, right? So to say the black church really is no different than saying the church. It's just a distinct branch of the church. Two is you have to acknowledge the historical connection, right? And so part of what makes the black church is a shared history, which in this country has meant oppression and marginalization, okay? And so that means the black church has been the area where people could come together. The black church was really the only place of dignity for black people for a long time. It was the only place where someone could be called sir or ma'am and not boy. It was the only place where black people could exercise real leadership among the people. It was the only place where they could possibly get trained in terms of literacy and education. And so there's that historical connection. But thirdly, the black church is known for its distinctives, right? We got black gospel music. We've got what's known as black preaching style. We've got one of the things I mentioned on the podcast is a very rich tradition of discipleship. I mean, if somebody expresses an interest in ministry, there's going to be somebody to take you under their wing and train you up. And so that's not to say that the black church is the only place where that happens, but those are some distinctives. I do want to talk about, like, the current.
Please.
I think the current civil rights movement, and I think if we're not in the next wave of the civil rights movement, we're right on the edge of it. I think the current wave of the civil rights movement impoverishes itself to the degree that it neglects the historic Christian faith, particularly coming out of the black church. anyone you want to look at as sort of heroes of the civil rights movement, most of them were people of faith. One of my favorites, who's not on everybody's radar, is Fannie Lou Hamer. Have y'all heard of her? Amazing woman from Louisville, Mississippi. Now, Louisville's about this big, and she was born a poor sharecropper. They didn't have enough money for shoes. She was the youngest of 20 kids. They didn't have enough money for shoes, so her mom used to wrap their feet in cloth so they wouldn't freeze on the soil in the winter. They used to eat onions and corn pone for dinner. She grew up a sharecropper. She started picking cotton when she was 6. And when she got married, she was a sharecropper too. One day she hears about voting rights, and she gets this fire in her to advance black voting rights. Well, the moment she does that, she gets kicked off the farm, the plantation, where her and her husband were. She's destitute and broke. Coming back from a voting rights rally, she gets arrested, taken to a prison. They lay her face down on a bed. They have 2 black prisoners forced to beat her with a blackjack to the point where she has permanent kidney damage and permanent eye damage, may have contributed to her relatively early death. Now, what would motivate, well, she's most well known for speaking at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. It was such a powerful testimony that Lyndon B. Johnson had his White House cut the television feed to her testimony because he didn't want the word of what happened to her getting out. Well, the networks came back later and put it on anyway, but that's how powerful she was. What would motivate someone to do all that? Is it really just a ballot? No. From Fannie Lou Hamer's mouth herself, she said it was because of her faith. It was because of what she believed about human dignity, the image of God, which, by the way, I think is the most important doctrine of the 21st century, besides issues of salvation, is the image of God. Because of what she believed and what she was taught about Christ, she was willing to go through all of that. And if you don't have some sort of transcendent motivation and strength to endure this suffering and persecution, you won't be able to endure it. You know? So this current movement needs to come from folks like you, people of faith who recognize that because of Genesis 1:26 and 27, where we're all made in the image of God, where we have equal dignity no matter what color you are, no matter what gender you are, it's people like that who we need leading the movement, because we actually have a permanent and universal foundation for what we believe and how we act.
I think it's interesting that you talk about faith motivating things like political action, protest, sacrifice in that regard, because in a lot of, I think, spaces you hear people act like the church should be apolitical, like the church should not engage issues of politics, that it should stay out of the pulpit, stay out of the body, that it's divisive, that it's like, gets in the way of the gospel. And so I guess I would love to hear you speak about whether you feel like Jesus, as our example, was apolitical, wholly a political activist, somewhere in between. Like, how do we find that center in who he was and is in us?
Good. But before I forget, I'm wearing my Black History Month t-shirt.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I love that. So was Jesus political? Was he apolitical? I think he was other political. And so Jesus is not political. Jesus is not apolitical. He's not halfway in between. He's something completely different. And so what he came saying was not, here's how you do politics. What he came saying is, here's the politics of the kingdom. What he came saying is, you are now citizens of heaven, the citizens of the heavenly kingdom, and this is how you should act. That's the entire Sermon on the Mount. He's saying, if you are going to be a citizen in the kingdom of God, this is how you should live. This is how you should act. And so go and live that way. And so, what
If you guys have any questions, Reverend Fields will be...
Okay, I thought you were taking the collection. This is round 1.
If y'all have any questions, feel free to run them.
We'll take donations. No, you just for college students. It's okay. I really thought you Yeah, so he came proclaiming the politics of the kingdom, which is otherworldly. Now, that being said, we are citizens of the heavenly kingdom, but since Jesus Christ came in, the kingdom has broken into the earth as we know it, and therefore we should live that way in this earth. Therefore, our heavenly citizenship should inform our earthly citizenship. So it's not as if Jesus suddenly makes us not U.S. citizens or not voters or not people with political interests. He says you can be and have and do all those things, but first and foremost, remember your citizenship in heaven and let that guide your politics and your justice and your faith.
That's real.
So I think as far as the church, there's certainly wisdom, right? We don't need to be out endorsing particular political candidates from the pulpit, which I know has probably happened, you've seen it or heard about it. I think that's probably a bridge too far, because neither major political party perfectly represents the values of the kingdom. And so we can't say this is the Christian party, because no matter which party you vote for, there's going to be compromises. Why? Because we live in a post-Genesis 3 world. There is sin, there is fallenness, and there's always going to be those imperfections. In politics, nobody's hands are clean. Nobody's hands are clean. You do the best you can. And that means also, if we really are heavenly minded about our earthly citizenship, we're actually not going to be uniform. Right? Because for some, justice in public education is going to be the factor. For some, it's going to be a pro-life stance. For some, it's going to be social support programs. And all of those have a place. And politics is way too complicated to simply say everybody needs to vote this way. That's my opinion. And you can take it or leave it.
So I think it would be interesting to put that opinion in conversation with one of your more recent articles about post-election. You made a pretty, I think, controversial statement. I think I saw some interesting feedback in the comment section.
I got in trouble, yeah.
Yeah, about even though you're kind of saying, okay, it's not one political party, after the election you said that you didn't feel safe worshiping in a church with white people. And that's kind of like a strong statement. But it sounded, from your article, it seemed like it was honestly where you were coming from, and I think that it's important to talk about what you mean and how does that sentiment then interact with what you just said about there being so many different interpretations, not even just different interpretations, different emphases that people have in their faith on.
That's good. So context is key.
Yeah,
Sorry. No. It was honest. It was honest. I think November 9th, and especially November 10th, all of us were feeling some kind of way. And so we recorded a podcast immediately after that, and then I put out a blog post to that effect, just for further context. But here's what I said. I said I didn't believe anyone's vote was a sin, right? If you voted your conscience, you voted your conscience. And we shouldn't say because you voted for this candidate, you sinned. A lot of times we have folks in the predominant white culture saying that you can only vote a certain way, and then if you don't, you sin, and vice versa, right? I don't think that's accurate, and I said that. So I don't think anybody's vote was a sin if you voted your conscience. However, voting your conscience doesn't mean there aren't consequences, right? So we would have had to deal with the consequences no matter who was president and no matter who you cast your vote for. Even though you voted your conscience, understand there are ramifications to that. So what I was saying was, with the now president that we have, some of the rhetoric that was coming out of his mouth or from his supporters, many minorities, not just African Americans, you're talking refugees, immigrants, you're talking Muslims, you're talking women, many people expressed concern because when you are in a marginalized position, you hear it and you know what it's saying or where it might lead. And so in the election, I felt like many minorities were speaking up and saying, hey, this is not going to lead to our flourishing, no matter how good it may be for other constituents. And I personally felt, particularly because of my work in racial reconciliation, I go into a lot of predominantly white spaces and I talk about race. And there's a lot of lip service given to, yeah, we want this, we want diversity, and yet, when we raise our voices and mention our concern or mention our pain, and then 81%, 8 out of 10, white evangelicals, self-identified, right, however you want to parse that, vote for this person who we said the language and the actions and the pattern we saw could be detrimental. To me, that felt like a betrayal. It felt like you wanted me there for aesthetic reasons, but you didn't want to hear my voice. So my thing is, if you are truly about diversity and inclusion, then minorities, their voices must not only be heard, they must be heeded. Okay, so if our presence and our perspective isn't enough to affect your voting pattern, I'm wondering, right, this is the safe part. When you're driving, the definition of a blind spot is an area where you can't see, right? And you may switch lanes and hit another car. You never intended to, but it's a blind spot. I was wondering, and I was concerned about what other potential blind spots folks in my congregation may have, or just folks who I interact with may have, without ever meaning to. They might do me or my family harm. And so, no, I didn't feel safe, but guess what? I still worship at a church that's predominantly white. I'm still part of a denomination that's predominantly white. And so the backlash was very interesting because you say you want me in your presence, but you don't value my perspective. And that's what hurt. So it still hurts. And I don't know, but I can say by the grace of God and with the strength of the Holy Spirit, I will continue to engage, and I'm not going anywhere. I will continue to raise my voice for what I feel is just.
Yeah. So I have one last question, and then I'll transition to some other people's questions. But so when there's collateral damage to you voicing your thoughts and your perspective on different things, and when sometimes it seems like you can say these things, it's still not necessarily cause a change in hearts, and maybe in some places it does, but in other places you see persistent injustice or inequality. How do you go about picking your battles? We talk a lot about, I think, the emotional labor that comes from trying to explain things, from trying to continually be patient, and you get a lot of be patient, you get a lot of calm down, you get a lot of let's all, just kind of sometimes it's like you're encouraged to not pick that battle, and that would be more like acquiescence, and then other times, it's like people want to talk about it, and you're like, I don't have the energy. It's, I guess, just how do you go about picking your battles, when to speak up, when to fall back, when to go worship in that space, and when to say, no, I need to actually go somewhere else or be by myself or whatever it is that I need to do. I guess, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, so you've got a spectrum of people, right, when it comes to issues of race and justice. You got some people who are very reticent and will almost never speak up, and certainly not publicly. And those folks probably need to be encouraged to be a little bit more forthright. Then you got other people you got to hold back because they won't shut up, and those folks probably need to put a seatbelt on, right? So we each need to figure out where we are and what our tendency is. As I think about the battles to pick and the ones I engage in, I think of a couple of things. In a lot of the leadership literature and the business literature, you'll hear about circles of influence and circles of concern. So your circle of concern can be very broad. It can be global, really. I mean, you can be worried about what's happening in Suriname or Indonesia, what's happening in France. You can be worried about what's happening to the poor. You can be worried about your own neighborhood and your own community. So your circle of concern is as big and broad as you want it to be. Your circle of influence, however, is very small. Your circle of influence is localized. It has to do with what organizations you're a part of, what relationships you have. And so as I look at the sort of battles to fight and really engage in, there are a lot of righteous causes out there, but there's only a select few that are within my circle of influence. And so if I'm not in a position where I can actually affect change, that's going to modulate my activity, if you will. And so I try to have a broad circle of concern, but focus on my circle of influence. Beyond that, I think we really have to be sensitive to the Holy Spirit. If something is continually bugging me, it just won't go away, I take that as a prod that maybe I need to engage in this. So, that sounds all spiritual and whatnot, but you know what I mean. If something is really burdening you, really bugging you, throw it out there, see what happens. But here's the kicker. We got to be gracious. I mean, when Jesus says love your enemies, he means love your enemies. And you can't look at the cross and think you don't need to take him at his word. Because for whom did he die? His enemies, while we were yet enemies, okay? Which means that the racist sitting across from me is the one whom I'm called to love. No matter what the vitriol they spit, no matter what deflection or diversion they try to get off topic, I can't go to a level of unrighteous, unbiblical anger. Now, there is such a thing as righteous anger, and that's okay to express, but sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. So you got to be careful, and I err on the side of grace, right? I err on the side of humility, and so better for me if I miss an opportunity to express righteous anger than I express unrighteous anger and damage a relationship, because I can always circle back around and say, here's what I really think to say. So yeah, it's difficult, but you can't fight every battle. Fight the battles where you can actually make a change and make a difference.
And I guess I'm wondering also, is that advice different, I guess, for people who are maybe less directly impacted by issues of racism? So I'm thinking about like white brothers and sisters who, I guess, maybe have race as a part of their broad area of concern, but maybe don't consider it a part of something that they have a place to influence or make an impact. And what is your call? Because I think that, to be honest, just being honest, I think that we are pretty familiar with the call for minorities to love their white brothers and sisters. But can you talk about what does it look like for white brothers and sisters to really love, like cross kind of love, you know what I mean? Their black brothers and sisters in these conversations, in these issues, and in a way that actually also has an impact, and it's not just
Yes. I mean, first of all, I need to preface, I love all kind of people, right? All guys.
The word all just has a negative association these days. I don't know.
The word?
Love?
All kind? All.
Yeah, all.
Okay, yeah, not all. Yeah, I know what you're saying. Not like that.
I know what you're saying. I'm just playing.
What I mean is, oftentimes, especially as you look at U.S. history, the critique falls upon what white people have done, right? And one of the things I want to make clear is I'm not trying to, drop this burden of white guilt on anyone. However, there is such a thing called godly grief, which leads to repentance. And that's what I think folks in the majority maybe need to feel, is a godly grief for events that have occurred, things that have happened, situations that are still going on today. And so you ask, what is sort of the responsibility of folks in the majority? I think it's solidarity. So solidarity requires empathy, which means feeling really the pain that we feel, weeping with those who weep. When one part of the body suffers, all of us suffer. we need to feel that, and that the injustice and the oppression isn't just on black people, but this is on my brother or sister in Christ, or even if they're not a Christian, it's on my fellow image bearer. And so folks in the majority need to feel the weight and burden of that pain along with minorities. Beyond that, there has to be truth before there's reconciliation. And so a lot of times, especially as I bring up historical examples, this is something folks want to sweep under the rug and not deal with and say, oh, we're past that. Well, if we've never actually contended with the past, we can't be reconciled in the present. And so we got to tell truth, and we've got to let that truth be spoken, whether that's sort of a national truth or your individual truth of your experience. And folks in the majority need to hear that and need to make space for that. Folks in the majority also need to listen. All right? Why do we have a Black History Month? Because the voices of black people in America have been silenced when it comes to history. Silenced in so many areas of life.